I grew up on a farm in Suffolk, always had a bit of an interest in engineering and the environment. I was always taking things to pieces and fixing things and making things, understanding nature and the seasons and being aware of climate and things like that. I was always on a path to understand climate change and have a sort of a calling to that. I then went through the state school system, ended up doing engineering as further education, and then at the end I did a degree in aeronautical engineering. There's been a convergence of my interest in renewables and my interest in flying, which has kind of led from those beginnings. Having my first child really catalysed my interest in climate change and actually the enormity of the problem. I kind of describe it as a bit of an epiphany.
Tell me more about that epiphany.
It's the recognition that over hundreds and hundreds of millions of years, the ecosystems of the world have been sequestering carbon into the ground in the form of coal and oil and gas. And effectively since the Industrial Revolution, which is a geological blink of an eye, we've set fire to that. Boom, it's gone. And if we don't think that that's going to have an impact on our lives and the biosphere, then we're incredibly naive. My daughter's primary school was the catalyst for going beyond just doing what I do at my home with my solar. It became the seed for Green Energy Nayland, which is an industrial and providence society which I set up as a cooperatively owned energy generator where we use the feed-in tariff income from a solar install to attract local investors. A lot of that was about opening people's eyes in my local community to what needs to happen and also how easy some of this stuff can be if you put your mind to it. But as time progressed, I just got to a point where I just thought, you know what, I need to do more than this. The recognition that actually utility scale solar is a very important part of the energy transition. And that was when I joined the utility scale solar industry and started working for an EPC. I started experimenting with a drone with a thermographic camera to assess the condition of a panel. A hotspot or a hot module is an indication of a problem. Using a drone, you could actually inspect 100% of the solar panels. And as part of that realization that people would probably be interested in understanding 100% of their module's condition, you had to come up with a way of presenting that data to a client. And we knew that we had to provide a digital solution for this.
How do you see the democratization of energy in the Naylands project, giving local people the power to generate their own energy security, and your larger scale work in the utility scale solar industry, like running parallel in the role they're going to play in the future? Hello, and welcome back to CleanTalk, the podcast shining a spotlight on inspiring companies and organisations and professionals across the world of renewable energy and clean technology. Today, I'm at Above in Essex, and we're going to be chatting here with Will Hitchcock, who's the CEO, about what their solutions do. Will, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Will, we always start with a little bit about our guests, a bit of biography on their past. Where did you come from?
I am a farmer's son. I grew up on a farm in Suffolk. Always had a bit of an interest in engineering and the environment. So they were kind of my sort of interests that I think my career, would have taken me to. Growing up on a farm was great in terms of understanding nature and the seasons and being aware of climate and things like that. So I think I was always on a path to kind of understand what's happening with climate change and have a sort of a calling to that.
Talk me through your sort of teen life in terms of education, what you're studying, what kind of captivated you at school?
As a kid, I was always working on the farm. So always, I grew up earning what I wanted to buy.
Sure.
So I had a job on my doorstep. So, and I grew up in a family of four. I had a brother and two sisters, have a brother and two sisters. And it was a very active farm. And, I then went through the state school system, ended up doing engineering as further education. And then at the end, I did a degree in aeronautical engineering. There's been a sort of a thread through this where I've always had an interest in aircraft. And I actually got my pilot's license when I was 18, and I've been flying light aircraft ever since. So although it's slightly at odds with my environmental stance, there's been a convergence of my interest in renewables and my interest in flying, which has kind of led from those beginnings. At the farm, I always had an interest in engineering because I was always taking things to pieces and fixing things and making things.
This is a common thread with the engineers. I like this. When you're taking things apart and putting them back together, This is something I've found interesting with other guests on the show, is some of them, like one, Colin Toohey said he liked taking things apart just to like dissect stuff.
Yeah.
Were you trying to understand things so you could put them back together so you could build things, or was it like a diagnostic curiosity, as Colin put it?
It was a bit of both. I think, I can remember an old lawnmower not being used anymore because it's beyond economic repair or whatever, and just taking it apart just out of interest to see how it all hung together. But some of it was when, one of my motorbikes might have broken and I had to replace a piston or piston rings or something like that, something relatively straightforward, but I would do it myself because I wanted to know how it worked. So it was a bit of both. But I think the other thing that was a thread through that period was really, really big interest in aviation. So I was one of these people that was building radio-controlled airplanes from balsa wood, and actually plans and cutting the balsa wood and building the airplane with little petrol engines on them and then crashing them after about 10 minutes and being quite upset. So I think, there was definitely a thread of making stuff, creating stuff. And there were, the instantaneousness of our lives now is polar opposites to what it was like. So, you could have spent 3 months building a balsa wood airplane and then 5 minutes destroying it. But now it's kind of, you just buy things on Amazon, and then if you crash them, it's not such a hard thing to take. It's just cost you a bit of money, right? Not your time. But I think back then there was a lot more I was much more about the journey rather than the destination.
Interesting.
Yeah.
How does that play into your work now?
Well, this whole industry is on a very ambitious journey. And I think every step of the way where we're delivering more and more insights and value through our services, we are playing our part in making the utility scale solar industry better, more efficient, build better assets, longer lasting assets, generate more solar electricity. And I can see that coming through our services. And that's really motivational. Yeah. So I had motorbikes, I had cars on the fields. I was always fiddling with engines and mechanical things. So I always had an interest in that, as well as an interest in nature and the harvest and all of those kind of things. I then sort of had this period of time where I went to university in London, and then I just ended up staying in London after a bit of traveling. And the engineering just sort of swung into technology in terms of IT. So that sort of brought me into working in banks and law firms, just running software development teams. I ended up running second line support teams, and then doing a lot of project management and deployment of enterprise scale IT systems. So that was probably 20 years. And then I had a calling for renewables. While I was in the corporate IT world, I did a lot of work around energy efficiency in terms of how we use desktops, servers, printing, data storage to reduce the impact of IT from an energy consumption perspective. So I was always very active in that space. And I think with the boom in the UK utility scale solar industry was a real calling for me to change my career and get into something that really meant something to me. And that was what happened in 2014.
I'd imagine that was quite a tense sort of stream of your career. The characters and the personality profiles that do well in London are kind of very intense. How did you juggle what would have been quite an intense or a need for intensity in your work with the fact that you also had that sort of sideline passion for sustainability underlying it?
When you're living in London and working in London, you're one step removed from the natural world. And I think I just threw myself into my career and my interest in technology in those early years. And so this was during the late 90s and the early noughties. So I ended up going into the .com industry as well. So I sort of left that banking world and went into .com and went through a few iterations of a .com that I joined in terms of it was merged and acquired, et cetera, et cetera. So that was an incredibly valuable bit of experience in terms of bringing together companies and their systems and reconciling all of those services and things like that. So that sort of took me into getting a flavor of startup and how startup felt. It was a very small company when I joined it. I think it was sub 40 people and it was 400 when I left it. And really it was the return to the countryside, which drew me out of the banking and into the legal industry, because I got a job that was half in Colchester, half in London, which meant I could start to come back to living outside of London. And it was a time in my life when I was starting a family. So it worked really well from that perspective.
On the more personal front, what was it like to make that transition? I mean, you say about starting a family. Did you find that was your family started before you made that transition? Was there like a tension or a strain before you decided to get that new job?
No, it was actually really great circumstances that played out, which meant that when that was virtually imminent that I was going to have a family, then this career opportunity came up with the law firm, which allowed me to move out of London. So it was really, really perfect timing. And I always look back on that time and think, thank goodness that happened when it did, because it's all about work-life balance when you're going through that stage of life.
Yeah.
And so that became much more important then, and I was able to do that.
From the families that I sort of know, they tend to kind of get more sort of introspective and philosophical when they have kids. They're like, what am I standing for? What are my values? Did you at all, I mean, you probably didn't, I don't know, think about like, what do I want my kids to kind of see in my career?
Absolutely, yeah. Having my first child was an absolute trigger for a rethink of career and what's important. When I moved out of London and bought my first sort of proper house, if you like, I was always very mindful of energy efficiency. So I became quite obsessed about the built environment and what I could do. So I put solar on my house, solar PV, I put solar thermal, energy efficient things like heat recovery, ventilation, and all this kind of stuff. So I did a whole load of work on the house right at the beginning of moving. And having my first child really catalyzed my interest in climate change and actually the enormity of the problem and the severity of the problem. I kind of describe it as a bit of an epiphany. And I think beyond that point, I couldn't unsee what I now understood. And that was what took me into this direction. And my daughter's primary school was the sort of catalyst for going beyond just doing what I do at my home with my solar. So it was at the primary school where we that became the kind of the seed for Green Energy Nayland, which is a industrial and providence society, which I set up. I think it's about 14 years ago now, which was it was a UK first. It was a cooperatively owned energy generator where we used the feed-in tariff income from a solar install to attract local investors. And that meant sort of people up to, down as low as £200 investment into something that was producing electricity from sun, which was just amazing. So yeah, that all happened really quickly when I had children. It really catalyzed my energy for this sector.
Tell me more about that epiphany.
It's the recognition that over hundreds and hundreds of millions of years, the ecosystems of the world have been sequestering carbon into the ground in the form of coal and oil and gas. And effectively since the Industrial Revolution, which is a geological blink of an eye, we've just set fire to that reserve of fuel. Boom, it's gone. And if we don't think that that's going to have an impact on our lives and the biosphere, then we're incredibly naive.
What's the sort of contrast like working, sort of having a passion for turning sort of a local community that your family's been part of into a sort of a statement of sustainability versus the larger work you're doing? How do you see them both?
A lot of the work that I did in terms of that local solar project was about opening people's eyes in my local community to what needs to happen and also how easy some of this stuff can be if you put your mind to it, right? So there was a desire to kind of make to raise awareness in my immediate community. But then I think as time progressed and the urgency keeps increasing, that it was time, the recognition that actually utility scale solar is actually, is a very important part of the energy transition. And I guess in honesty, I got frustrated at the pace of change that I could make happen with community driven change. I was surprised at how much effort it took to bring people on that journey. And there are a number of other things that I did around that, like, sort of extending the allotments and, trying to increase the amount of homegrown food and, car share and all of those things that make a community sustainable. And I think I just got to a point where I just thought, I need to do more than this. And that was when I joined the utility scale solar industry and started working for an EPC. And that's when I started building utility scale solar assets. And that's really where a lot of my experience, my prior career experience, a lot of it was centered around project management.
It's a very helpful skill set.
It really proved how industry agnostic good project management skills are. And, all the projects I'd had thus far were digital projects. They were about change management and rollout of software and software development. So kind of intangible things. But I also think that my grounding in physical things by growing up on a farm meant that when it came to building a utility scale solar in a muddy field in the UK, there was a good coming together of experience on the farm and the governance and control around running a successful project, risk management, issue management, budget control and milestones and Gantt charts. All the principles are the same. And it was just bringing that governance and control to a solar project. I became quite successful at running those projects.
It's one thing to understand project management. It's another thing to be able to manage people. How did that skill set develop? How early on? And what are the sort of lessons you've learned along the way of growing teams?
Bringing people along with you is a really hard part of that. You can have Prince 2 project management qualifications, but if you can't bring people along and get your project gelling, then it won't be successful. And so I think just being able to adapt style to different stakeholders of a project is a really key skill to successfully managing projects. And I also think that when it came into the renewable space, what was amazing about becoming part of this industry was meeting people who had a similar calling. And if you believe passionately about what you're doing and the importance of it, then it becomes a far easier job to do. And you can bring people along who are like-minded far easier than those that aren't.
You talked about different stakeholders. Give me some examples.
Well, managing projects in a law firm, you have lawyers and partners who have, they're very strong-minded and they have strong views on things, but perhaps not necessarily on technology. So working at that end of the spectrum where you're dealing with senior partners down to software developers and business analysts. So there's a whole multitude of sort of personality types and strength of position in the organization that you've got to be able to manage. And they all have different needs and different angles and lenses on things. And so it's about, getting in their head and understanding that is really important. So that sort of diversity comes with most projects.
You're trying to get them to change their perspective on something. How do you go about it, and how does that translate to other types of personality profiles?
What was quite often the case with working with a senior partner at a law firm is they would very often think they knew what they needed and they knew the answer. So it's about turning what they think they need into what they actually require in terms of, what are your requirements rather than what's the solution. So that angle is always a difficult one to go to someone of seniority and authority in a business and say, I see why you think you need this, but can I give you an alternate view on this? And let's go back to what are you trying to achieve? Those kind of questions at the beginning of a project are absolutely vital in giving it some chance of success. That's an example that resonates because it happened a lot in that job. Yeah.
Do you have an example that's kind of polar opposite that you can think of?
Working at Above.
Okay.
Yeah. I think the journey that so many of the team have been on at Above has been from its early beginnings, that the alignment we have in the way we work together and that working rhythm is so well sort of synergist that it just means a lot of these things are so much easier to make happen. So I guess it goes to the other end of the spectrum where you've got incredibly well-aligned, like-minded people, passionate about what they do, just makes things happen much more naturally. So that's probably the other end of the spectrum, yeah.
So we're here today at Above, which you run. Tell us what the vision, mission and values were when you founded this company.
If we can bring digital, geospatial, digital technology, robotics to the solar industry, it will improve the success of the industry in terms of its deployment rates, the quality of what it builds, and therefore its contribution to decarbonising. So our mission is just to bring technology solutions to address the challenges that the industry is facing. That's kind of it in a nutshell. And robotics, whether it's aerial or ground-based robotics, will play a bigger and bigger part in the solar industry as the adoption increases. And we're front and centre of that bringing that technology to this industry. When I was building utility scale solar, the assets that were being built in the UK at that time were bigger than anything that had been built previously in all the other sort of European markets. And so this is where the aviation interest and solar came together. And I quickly started using a drone to look at the construction of the projects that I was building when I was working as part of an EPC. And I think that was probably an industry first, in that one of the milestone completion points of a project, which is a key milestone and a financial transaction, was evidenced just through aerial data rather than an engineer coming to site and auditing the site. So that was a bit of an industry first. And then it was towards the end of 2015, I started experimenting with a drone with a thermographic camera on it. So thermography is a technique to assess the condition of a panel, because a hot spot or a hot module is an indication of a problem and energy loss. And there had been some academic work around the use of a drone and a thermographic camera, but there was no sort of service in the market at that time. And we built a custom drone with a custom gimbal, and we had a GoPro camera and a very early incarnation of a thermographic sensor, and started looking at some of the assets that the last project I'd commissioned. And it was very evident there was a lot of things that were useful to know about in terms of anomalies in the array that monitoring through the string monitoring services wasn't going to pick up. So I sort of immediately thought there's some commercial value in this. And people understanding where there are anomalies in the modules and the strings, etc., is actually going to be useful, not only from a performance point of view of the asset, but actually these anomalies tend to get worse if they're not dealt with, right? So there was definitely a sort of a eureka moment that this was going to be something that was going to be useful to the industry. And what it meant was, as it started to play out, was that using a drone, you could actually inspect 100% of the solar panels. So this is pretty much logistically impossible to do by hand on very large assets with very large tables. So your solar panels are quite high up to reach. And so we sort of realized that this is akin to 100% module condition monitoring. And that was what really catalyzed the forming of Above. And as part of that realization that people will probably be interested in understanding 100% of their module's condition, you had to come up with a way of presenting that data, those results, to a client. And so from the very word go, we steered away from spreadsheets and PDFs, and we knew that we had to provide a digital solution for this. And this was the very early beginnings of what is now called a digital twin.
Interesting.
And so we took the CAD drawing that would been used to design and construct the asset, and we turned that into a digital reporting tool where we could report the condition of every single module on that part. So there was some two real key sort of points there for the industry: 100% module condition monitoring, and the sort of emergence of digital twins.
When did digital twins get taken into other industries? So I've heard of them being used in offshore wind. What was the journey with them and being wider adopted?
I think the concept of a digital rendition of a piece of infrastructure or an asset isn't that new. I think, the digital twin has become a bit of a buzzword, and it sometimes means different things to different people. And just to sort of clarify, in the context of solar, you've got a very, with large scale solar, you've got an asset which sprawls over, sometimes hundreds of hectares. And so you've got an immediate challenge to your asset in that the components are highly distributed, right? So if you look at a wind turbine or a gas generating plant, they're very concentrated pieces of equipment, whereas solar is very distributed. So that geospatial distribution of components leads to challenges in how you monitor and operate that asset because of the area it covers and sometimes hundreds and hundreds of thousands of those components. And so when we started building what we now call a digital twin, it's our solar gain product, is that we basically create a digital representation that understands the geospatial layout as well as the electrical layout. And the key thing is that it understands electrical layout. So a solar panel in the digital twin knows where it is in the field, it knows where it is in the table, and it also knows where it is within the electrical circuit. It knows it belongs to string X, combiner box Y, inverter Z, transformer A, or whatever, right? And I think it's understanding the geospatial and the electrical context is a massive kind of time saver for the industry in terms of how you use data. but also it answers questions, because the geospatial layout of an asset also needs to be understood when you're trying to fault diagnose, because some areas of the site might, for instance, be more prone to flooding than another. Some areas of a site might be built with a different batch of modules. And therefore, knowing where they are physically as well as where they are electrically answers questions. And that's the kind of secret sauce in what we've brought to the market. And we've now leveraged that digital platform, not just for our own drone data, but also other forms of testing and inspection and measurement data. So stuff that might go on the ground, like RISO tests or IV curves, or just visual inspections from the ground. If it's collated within a digital twin, then you can make a lot more use out of it. You can start to correlate with different data sets, and then interact with that data in a much more meaningful way.
Could you break down the last two? Did you say RISO set?
Yeah, so RISO, resistance isolation test, is a test that an electrical engineer will do on site to identify whether there are problems of current leakage in components or parts of the circuit. And those tests will typically end up in a spreadsheet or a PDF or an email, and not necessarily used on a time series basis. And I think what's absolutely critical to the industry as these assets age is that unless you can bring your testing and measurement inspection data together and understand it on a time series basis, you can't infer root cause, resolution, and you can't predict the future. And the amount of data that's being collected that's residing in silos still in the industry is frustrating, and a massive opportunity for the industry once it starts doing this properly.
Did your interest in aviation did that play a role in the fact that you developed this thermal drone solution?
Yes, I would say so, because I had the confidence to go, if I can get a camera on a flying thing, I can do this. And, I used to fly radio controlled airplanes, so flying a drone wasn't a problem, right? So it meant that we could actually take an idea through to experimentation quite easily. So it must have played a part. And also the interest and the desire to do it would have been, rooted in my interest in flying as well as solar.
Can you explore for me how above solutions work throughout the lifespan of a solar farm from sort of start onwards?
Yeah, so originally we started off doing aerial thermography. So these are operating assets, and it was looking at how we can improve the knowledge of the health and the condition of those assets. But as our sort of exposure to the industry and also seeing the scale of these assets that are now being built worldwide. I mean, some of these assets, the sizes of them in terms of their sort of physical space they cover was unimaginable 5 years ago, right? So some of this stuff is, you're seeing gigawatt plus plants being built. And you contrast that to the early sort of Italian industry boom in 2010, where 1 megawatt was the kind of the size that was being built. So the growth in asset size has been significant and very quick, and therefore the tools needed to manage an asset through its design and planning all the way through construction and commissioning now lend themselves to a lot of what we were doing with the thermography. So starting from the beginning, greenfield development, understanding the intricacies of the terrain is vital to designing the optimal layout for your solar array in terms of shading between rows, so spacing of rows, the near shading of things on the periphery, and even horizon shading of hills and things in the sort of immediate area. That all now becomes quite, it's a very important thing to get right, because we're now in the post-subsidy era, which has previously sort of propped the value of solar up. Now we're in post-subsidy. So these assets have to be really well designed and really efficiently run to wash their face, basically, to be viable generating plants. And so using drones and photogrammetry and sometimes LiDAR, we can map the terrain down to centimeter level of accuracy in terms of X, Y, and Z. And therefore, for that early stage of planning and array design, we can give a far richer, more valuable deliverable in that early stage. And we can cover vast areas very quickly. We tend to use fixed-wing drones on some of those large assets, so we can collect the data very quickly. And so that really starts at that earliest incarnation of the asset. We start that digital relationship with it, if you like.
Yeah.
Once you've gone through all the approvals and, you've got funding and grid and all the rest of it, and you start to build that asset, again, drones using photogrammetry, which is essentially visual imagery being used sort of with a geospatial dimension, which means pixels become measuring points, if that makes sense.
Vectors sort of thing.
So you sort of develop a point cloud, so you can understand the precise location of certain things that you're seeing in your visual imagery. It's a technique called photogrammetry, and it's incredibly powerful for large area mapping kind of activities. And within construction, we will fly an asset, typically on a weekly schedule, sometimes a little bit less, depends on the speed of construction. And we'll effectively scan that asset against its design CAD drawing to look for deviations in design and construction, and also to give a completely irrefutable evidence of the status of construction over time.
So you're looking for where the reality and the planning don't line up, looking for gaps.
Yeah, so where the design of the array and the positions of things relative to that design may deviate. But also it's about quantifying construction status, because the amount of piles and modules and structure and cabling that goes into an asset, is huge. And therefore being able to monitor the rate of construction and also see how, things are being managed on site. So it's like an eye in the sky on a weekly basis. So you're getting a view on the quality of the trenching, the quality of the cable management, the quality of how things are distributed on site. Also things like, health and safety, where excavations are left open, which is in breach of health and safety regulations. So it's almost like some of it's a bit of an audit of the construction site, as well as those other features that I've talked to. So it's becoming a norm now. A lot of our customers are developing assets in multiple geographies. And so if you've got a central engineering team who you want to have sort of final oversight of what you're constructing, it's incredibly difficult to get people to site on the frequency where they can actually make a difference to the quality of that outcome. So by supplementing engineering oversight with these kind of drone scans, if you like, is incredibly powerful. And it also gives a permanent record of the birth of that asset. So at that point in time, there was a decision made where that cable went that route, not that route, or the substation was repositioned because of flooding or whatever came. And that often gets lost in the construction. These assets are always under pressure to commission quickly. So there's always a pace to these assets, which means that there's a risk that sometimes corners might get cut.
Yeah.
And so being able to record that evolution, that birth of that asset is incredibly valuable for the ongoing life of that asset and whoever's going to have to maintain it.
From a market position perspective, how much of your, pitch or outward communication is centering on that sort of risk mitigation factor?
Yeah.
Because I see a lot of companies sort of in the offshore renewable space and onshore that, they center, even if their offering's not solely on it, they center a lot on risk mitigation and cost saving. Is that kind of elevated more than it should be?
Yeah, I think you can boil most of what we do down to risk mitigation and risk management. Some of it's physical risk, some of it's financial risk, some of it's technology risk, which is ultimately financial risk. I think that's a catch-all for a lot of these kind of quality assurance and oversight services. They do fall under that banner. I think the other thing that is really important to recognize is that during that construction monitoring phase, the deliverable at the end of this is is a very rich, information-rich digital incarnation of that asset, but then the operational and maintenance life of that asset that could span another 30 plus years, right? So, the risk mitigation value of that data persists with that asset beyond commissioning and beyond that actual activity of construction. Capturing component metadata, it's one of my big bugbears, is the importance of getting the module serial numbers into the digital twin at that point of commissioning, where you've got lots of labor on site. The site is probably clear of vegetation. Therefore, it's the optimal time in terms of the cost of that one-off activity to scan the serial numbers into the digital twin. And once you've got that data in the digital twin, the benefit and the value you can derive from that data is endless. And I can talk forever about the importance of that data.
you mentioned about one of the key things being the fact that you're trying to capture data that can then be used for a lifetime, essentially, or be useful for the next 30 years or so.
Yeah.
How do you ensure that data? Because I guess from a naive perspective like mine, the idea of a digital twin is like, you think of a 3D image of a solar array with information coming up about it, which obviously isn't what it actually is. But from that standpoint, how do you ensure that the data you're delivering is future-proofed from an interaction side? Say we're 30 years down the line, how do you ensure that the information you're capturing now and packaging is going to be like repackageable in whatever sort of digital ecosystem we're using?
It's a really good question, because it's one of the biggest challenges with the solar industry is the fragmented nature of the ecosystem of actors in the industry. So you might be talking to a different developer who sells the asset when it's shovel ready. Someone buys that shovel ready project. They're just going to fund it through construction. Then they're going to sell it as an operating asset. And then eventually it ends up in its long-term fund or utility or whatever. And even then they might be sold as working operating solar plants. So that in itself creates a perfect dynamic to lose data all the way through those stages. And it's a real loss. And it's one of the missions of our technology, and the reason we service from the beginning of the life of that asset is that we create a link between those stages of the asset. Now, if you're working for a utility or an IPP who is building asset, who's developing, constructing and operating, that journey is slightly easier. You're sort of vertically integrated. But even so, even with those organizations, they're quite fragmented internally, which doesn't necessarily mean that the drivers within each function are necessarily working together seamlessly. But your point about the relevance of the data. So the data is the most relevant and most fresh at the end of commissioning. And if that data isn't then maintained through the operation and maintenance of the plant, there is always a risk that the value of that digital asset starts to dwindle. And that's why it's important that the digital asset is seen as a part of the physical asset, right? It's really important that people go, I've got a physical solar farm and I've got a digital incarnation of it. And that is going to help me manage the risk, optimize yield, and manage the whole life of this asset to make it successful. And that's a journey that the industry is now getting, waking up to the value of that. It's very difficult to sell that digital journey from the outset for the virtue of the fact that the plant might change hands. So who's paying for that all the way through? It's one of the challenges that we do work with. You contrast the wind industry with the solar industry, and a lot of the equipment and the construction of the wind farm and the wind array, and then the operating of that is done by the same organization, the OEM, right? So your Siemens and your Vestas and people like that will make this stuff, bring it to site, build it and operate it. So they've got an immediate vested interest in the condition and the reporting and that sort of virtuous circle of making things better. In the solar industry, certainly on the solar panels perspective, which is a significant part of the capex of the project and a very important part of the components, it doesn't work like that, because the manufacturers don't get involved once they've left the factory.
Sure.
And that's something that the solar industry is having to wrestle with. And it's really becoming very apparent with some of the aging assets. And I've been talking about this on various posts on LinkedIn recently, that the UK assets that were built in that massive boom.
Expiring warranties.
This is it, right? So your module product warranty is typically 10 to 12 years, but your asset's got to last 25, 30, 40 years now, right? And so effectively beyond that point of product warranty, you haven't really got any recourse with the manufacturer. Not easy.
Okay.
And so what we're seeing is that despite a lot of preventative maintenance work happening during the life of the asset in the previous 10 years, it hasn't been collected and used in a way which has catalyzed a response to a degrading module population, right? Which has led to product warranty expiry looming or having passed before people realize that these modules are actually failing.
Yeah.
And if we'd had the data and we were using it in a time series basis, we would have probably got on top of this earlier, is my is my view on it. And so I think it really is the burning platform for doing things better, and capturing that information at commissioning and then building that into your preventative maintenance routine of using our tools. So we've got a suite of mobile interfaces to our digital twin platform. So all of the facilities are now in place to capture that data in the course of doing your O&M, right? And that means that you can start to use that to power some of the predictive insights, and help inform you of when you've got to respond to situations in a far more meaningful way.
Couple of questions.
Yeah.
One is, so going back to an older question that I didn't phrase very clearly, was how are you packaging that, I guess, software solution in a way that means that when the assets that it's being packaged to work for are like 30 years old, that I guess it can evolve with our sort of digital infrastructure, if you will, whether it be in quote unquote the metaverse or, you know, whatever like that.
Yeah.
Although it's quite an abstract question. I guess, how do you make sure that your IP is like, can evolve?
Well, the first thing is it's very difficult to reconstruct historic data on an aging asset.
Right.
So introducing digital tools to aging assets is an investment you have to make if you recognize that the next 15 years aren't necessarily going to play out as well as you hoped, and therefore being on the front foot today is better than tomorrow. So bringing aging assets up to that sort of level of digitalization is a piece of work that we're doing. A number of these, especially catalyzed by warranty claims or repowering, things like that. But really, it's about doing things differently for the future, right? So as a byproduct of construction and commissioning, you can create the ultimate digital foundation that's going to power the, decision-making for that asset. And it's at really no extra cost in terms of the relative cost of doing this, given the value of these assets. It's a rounding error on cable ties in the project cost. It's minor, but the value of that is significant. And then to answer your question about the sort of the relevance and the longevity, we're constantly evolving with technology. The use of AI, the use of predictive analytics, leveraging our big data to try and inform the future. Embracing drone in a box, the fully autonomous drones, which is the next sort of pivot point for drones in the context of solar, which we can come on to, but ground-based robotics as well, using robots that are doing mowing and cleaning to collect data while they're doing their day job. These are all things that we're constantly looking at where they fit, when they're going to be commercially appealing. And also there's nuances to the different markets and where they are in their maturity journey to the industry. It's something that's, when you're operating globally, as we are, markets are very, very different depending on what stage they are in their growth. The European market, I would label as a very mature market in an immature industry.
Okay.
So relatively mature, but the industry overall is still immature.
Sure.
And then you've got nuances like the way the subsidies work in the US market, where the projects receive their subsidy through the CapEx. So it's a infrastructure tax credit.
Right.
So there's more focus on construction rather than asset yield. Whereas in the European market, the focus of the subsidies was on what you generated. So there was always an interest in making the assets generate more because it gave you more income. And so just those two dynamics themselves have created a very different market to sell the services into in terms of, commercial proposition and what resonates with who.
Excellent. Let's talk more about autonomous drone in a box.
Yeah.
Can you break down what that involves?
The use of drones in solar immediately gives massive efficiencies in terms of, reducing human effort to go and do something that a human probably just couldn't do as well, right? So it immediately gives you that coverage, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a drone pilot at the end of it. And a lot of the cost of delivering that is the logistics of getting a pilot to site. It's the logistics of working with fickle weather that may be suboptimal to what activity you want to do. So there's all these kind of logistical nuances and cost that with the drone in a box, the potential is to remove most of that, right? And so the use cases for piloted drones are limited to the fact that it has to carry the costs of all those things I've described. Whereas if you've got a drone that's resident and it's a it's a paid for piece of equipment on an asset, suddenly the roles it can play in monitoring and from security to condition monitoring to responding to SCADA and other alerts is endless, right? So you've suddenly got this piece of infrastructure that can fulfill a load of new things that you wouldn't have even contemplated commercializing with a piloted solution. And really in the last 2 years, so we've been following this space closely. I think we can claim that we did the UK's first fully autonomous drone inspection, albeit there was a pilot watching what was going on site for regulatory purposes.
Sure.
About 2 years ago, just a bit more than 2 years ago. But it was very early hardware technology. And the concept was in its infancy. Since then, the technology that's available in terms of the hardware has moved on massively. So the price point has plummeted. And so therefore, the commercial viability of putting a drone in a box on a moderately sized solar farm suddenly stacks up. So we're working hard in developing the services that leverage that resident flying robot. But the commonality with what we're doing with the drone and our mobile tools is that you can collect lots and lots of data, but if you don't put it in a repository that allows you to use it, it's classified, it's against a component, and you can then use it on a time series basis. The value of that is severely diminished. So we see that the digital twin and the way we're using data as incredibly aligned with the emerging ground-based robotics. But we've got we have a number of conversations with people who are bringing those technologies to the market. And it's kind of watch this space, but we're focusing at the moment, our focus is on the drone in a box solution.
Talk to me about how your other solution, on-demand digital construction management, ties into drone in a box.
Our first sort of commercial service in the use of drone in a box technology is in the context of construction. So it's an easier use case to commercialize because a construction site has people on it, and there for an airspace regulatory perspective, we can satisfy the regulations by having an observer or a trained operative amongst the cohort on site, right? So it means that we can use that technology in that context far easier. It also means that you can carry out the scans at a higher frequency at a lower price point. So some of these construction projects might be evolving at a rate which necessitates a scan more frequently than perhaps budgets would permit. But it also means you can do stuff that on the fly, if something's happened on site and you want to capture it, you've got that drone there. So it's a really, really good use case. And that whole technology is taking us into a kind of an era of construction monitoring as a service or inspection as a service, which from a commercial perspective is a really useful model for people to work with from a budgetary perspective.
Yeah.
So basically, as you're scanning this asset and you're capturing that construction data through the build, all of this data is going into our platform SolarGain Pro, which this becomes this digital incarnation of your asset, if you like. And something that I'm absolutely passionate about getting the industry to wake up to is, and I mentioned before, is the importance of serial number scanning. And it's typically deemed as quite a laborious activity because there's no substitute for a human doing it. We've developed mobile applications which massively speed up the process, enhance the accuracy of it, etc. So there is a human element to it, but once it's in there, the magic starts. And what I mean by that is that the technology risk that the industry faces with modules in a fast-growing manufacturing base, factories are coming on stream, new technology is being built at scale. So there's risk in the modules that are being used to build these new assets. And understanding that risk is absolutely paramount to understanding how you're going to, manage that exposure as an asset owner, if you like. So getting the serial number scanned in means that we can import all of the factory test data, which includes an electroluminescence image and flash test data. So all the electrical properties of the module can be imported literally at a click of a button once those serial numbers are in there. And what that tells you about your module population. And I refer to it as a demographic. And what I mean by that is if you've got a 50 megawatt, 100 megawatt solar plant, you're going to have hundreds, thousands of modules. Some of them may have come from different factories. Some will have come from different batches. Some will be manufactured from a different bill of materials. And all of these factors will contribute to those modules aging differently and performing differently in the field. And unless you understand that module demographic, it's very difficult to manage that risk and what starts to play out in the operational life of the asset.
Yep.
So getting that data in at the beginning just pays dividends downstream. And referring back to the point around warranty claims, it just makes all of that seamless. It also allows you to triangulate on a particular batch that might be failing rather than the whole population. So some of it is going to be good news. You see something going wrong and you think, oh, the whole lot's going to go. Whereas actually it relates to one batch from one production line that is, X hundred or X thousand modules. And you can tell all of this from the serial number and the delivery information that comes with those modules. And at the moment, the industry is not using that in any way, shape or form of sophistication. Some of our more advanced customers are starting to get their head around how to use that and are using those services. But it's really important that the wider industry gets a grip of this. And the other thing is that when your modules are shipped from the factory, going back to my point about the OEM's involvement in the operational life, when they leave the factory, they're yours, right? So when they arrive on site, you need to know how they arrived on site. So one of the other things that I'm really hot on with my clients is pre-shipment quality assurance tests. So before they leave the factory, there are companies that can do audits of the production line and really understand what's being packaged on your behalf. So really digging into that, and not enough people are doing that. And then when they're delivered to site, then doing some sample testing, meaningful sort of ISO specification sampling, where you would do another EL test to look if there's been any damage in transit. Then you know what quality your modules arrived on site. So when they get handled beyond that point, shipped around the solar farm to be mounted on tables, is where sometimes damage can occur. But you've got that traceability all the way through if you take those steps to pre-shipment, post-shipment. And then tracking the serial numbers means that when we do the commissioning drone flight, when the park is powered, we can then see any anomalies or defects in those modules. And we know whether they arrived on site in that condition or not. Typically they didn't, because they would have been rejected. But it just means that the traceability and this kind of liability trail is way, way easier with that data. And this is all a byproduct from serial number scanning.
Is there any pushback on the OEM side to do this sort of thing?
Some people think that the OEMs would be very interested in our data, but actually that dynamic isn't really there because there's a lot of price sensitivity and it's all about price. I guess quality isn't disregarded, but it's not front and center as much as it should be.
Okay.
In terms of the purchasing of these components. But we work with the manufacturers when it comes to getting that data from the factory, and our customers purchasing divisions work with those manufacturers in getting that data. So there's that sort of hand holding through the manufacturing and then the pre-shipment.
Yep.
But beyond that, very little.
So we've covered the role of above, what it offers, why it's needed increasingly. Talk to me about your coverage globally. Where are you based and where are you operating?
We're based in the UK, but we operate, I say globally, we operate in about 25 countries at the moment. Our core markets are Europe, the UK, North America, and APAC. The most mature market of Europe is where we've grown out a lot of our services and developed our R&D focus based on our knowledge of aging assets and what's needed to manage that risk. And I think what's really important to get across is that those things will play out in other markets as they age. So we've made a big investment in the North American market in terms of we've doubled down in terms of account management and sales team in that market. And there we're seeing a huge, huge amount of growth in the construction of assets. And so that the installed capacity is growing exponentially in that market. So we're really focused on getting a foothold there. We bring a lot of European experience to that market. They are suffering from the same challenges that you find with assets growing in scale. They're still using the same technology. So there's a lot of overlap with what we've learned in the European market that we can bring to North America. The other interesting dynamic with the North American market is that because the subsidy, as I explained before, is a construction-related subsidy, that as these assets start to age, that investment, that focus on construction and not necessarily the operational life of the asset is starting to play out. And we read there's a report published recently, which said that the US asset portfolio is underperforming by between 7 and 13%. And so there's a lot of opportunity there to do things better. And I think Above is very well placed to do that.
What are some of the challenges you foresee in that sort of market shift?
Recognition that the level of sort of monitoring and oversight they have of condition of components and how the plant is operating hasn't been front and center in their capital expenditure on assets. But actually without that, I'm sort of highlighting things like string level monitoring, which became very prevalent in the European market, is relatively absent from the US market. I think you'll see an increase in that. And also going back to the drone in a box in the operational context, being able to identify areas that are offline that is invisible to the sort of basic level of monitoring that those assets typically have, will have a value proposition very, very quickly.
Is there anything coming up in terms of appearances, media-wise, or event that you've got going on in the North American space?
Well, the biggest event in North America for solar is RE+, and that's happening early September. We'll have a team there. We've got a booth there. So definitely, come and see us at that event if you're there. We are pushing a lot on the construction monitoring, construction management, and the drone in a box application there. So yeah, lots of new tech to show off at that event. And I was there last year, and it's huge. So the attendance of that is amazing. So it'll be a really good platform for our kind of relaunch in that market.
What are you hoping to achieve there?
Build business, right? Understand what's going on, understand the challenges. Every year that moves on, people are starting to experience the legacy of aging assets, and therefore a lot of our services and our operational services start to resonate stronger. Yeah. So I'm expecting to see an uptick in interest in the operational side of assets and what we can bring to that space.
When you said about you've invested heavily in the North American market, what's that looked like up until now? What have you been doing?
The way we deliver our services, we use drone service providers. So actually the investment in a market is typically around sales and account management and client support. To deliver our services, we've got a drone service provider network of about 300 operators. So we can be very light touch in certain markets. Sometimes our clients take us to very remote locations, and actually we just need to find a drone operator with the right equipment to fulfill that need. So in those scenarios, we can be very light-footed. But in the US market, it's about having a stronger, more stable presence to be able to service those clients in that time zone.
Yep.
And that requires boots on the ground. And that's why we've made that extra investment.
It's been really interesting to sort of get sort of like a two-sided story from you. One about the localized, sort of decentralized energy, sort of the democratization of energy, should we call it, in the Nayland project, giving local people the power to generate their own sort of energy security. With your larger scale work in the utility scale solar industry, like what's the balance between those? How do you see those two, I guess, stories, if you will, or narratives like running parallel in the role they're going to play in the future?
I was absolutely focused on this notion that I think it was after my own experience of solar at home, realizing that in relatively cloudy UK, you can still make a difference to your energy needs from solar. And now, I mean, I have put array on my house a long, long time ago. Now the cost of storage is so much lower, battery storage, that actually solar in the UK from a residential perspective is even more compelling. But I think, yeah, I'm a big believer in the kind of democratization, decentralized energy generation is a necessity in tackling climate change and decarbonizing our energy system. And I think, although the utility scale solar are vast multi-million pound projects, it's distributed. It's way more distributed than central generation. So coal and gas or whatever, and nuclear. And therefore, the actors you've got, the amount of IPPs that are emerging, the independent power producers, means that by the virtue of that, you're still going to be, you are still democratizing energy provision for people. And so people are going to have choices, and that itself is absolutely vital. And I also think this sort of recognition of where your energy comes from and using energy more responsibly sort of plays into that whole narrative of renewables, whereas, there's a socket in the wall and no one really thinks about it. I think that will, that will contribute to a behavior change about being more conservationally minded about what we consume, whether that's energy and other things.
I've heard a couple of perspectives on either side of that in terms of conservatism with energy going forwards. Is it possible that we'll get to a point where conservation doesn't matter because of how efficiently we're generating in the first place? Like, will there be a day when we can, not that we'd want to, but, leave the lights on running all day without really worrying about it?
I think that would be a lovely thing to happen, but I think it's highly unlikely. I think when you look at how much energy, not electricity, but energy demand is going to swing towards electricity with electrifying transport and space heating. So space heating and transport are massive consumers of energy, but it's currently fossil energy mostly. If you electrify that, the need for renewables is just going to carry on increasing. So I think we're a long way off getting to the point where we're complacent about energy. But I do think local and family-led level resilience is possible with the use of renewables at your house and battery storage at your house. So the more localized your generation and storage, the more resilient you are to system issues or global shocks or whatever, right? So I think it's going to be kind of multi-tiered, multi-layered in that regard. But I think the challenge of, as we swing more and more across, energy needs into using electricity, the needs to generate that electricity in a renewable form is not going to abate for some time.
Both personally and corporately with Above, what are your plans for the future? What have you got your eye on, new ideas?
The rate of growth of the solar industry is going to present new challenges. The technology, the fast changing technology within that space that we don't necessarily know about today, right? So we're always keeping an eye on what's going on within our kind of client base, but also on the R&D and so the research space. So we're involved in a number of research projects. We've been doing R&D, putting R&D at the forefront of what we do for many years. And we work on a number of collaborative projects across Europe. So with Horizon 2020 funding, we work with consortiums. And one which is of particular interest to me is this Agri-PV. So this is making more combined use of finite land. And that's going to be a problem in some markets like Europe and maybe the Netherlands, in Asia Pacific. There's going to be competition for land usage, right? So being able to use combined PV and agriculture is a really interesting space. And with my farming background, that's of particular interest to see how having a structure over a period of a space of land can potentially change what you can grow on it and how long you can grow things on it. But at the same time, generating energy for the use by the farm, by the equipment, by the processing machinery on that farm itself. So a really kind of closed loop system, really interesting space.
Agriculture is known for its high emissions. Is there what's the potential beyond just, utilizing the solar for their sort of own energy needs to transform the agriculture scene?
One of the things that we as humanity have to recognize is that we've created a very energy intensive food system. And I always use the analogy that less than 100 years ago, when most of agricultural machinery was horses, you had to have vast swathes of land to grow food that was just for the horses in order to be your machines. And so the idea of a farm generating its own electricity to power its own needs is actually quite a compelling proposition, and actually not too dissimilar to what we were doing before we became completely hooked on diesel in the context of agriculture. So I think that's that potential of generating electricity to power the machinery to produce food is one that humanity's got to get to grips with. So I see Agri-PV as an early stage into that.
Do you think it will serve as a sort of a statement to the rest of the sort of food supply chain if that is done well? to sort of the potential to decarbonise?
Absolutely, because I think as time progresses, our commercial ability, as well as from an environmental perspective, to move food around vast distances around the planet, will just become completely unthinkable.
Sure.
And it's at that point where these early stage R&D projects will come into their own. So I think we have to accept that there's an inevitability. How quickly it will come depends on how quickly we move on this. But there's no doubting the fact that our food system is highly inefficient, not to mention food waste, but it's highly inefficient from an energy perspective. But the solutions to make it more inefficient are already there. We're just not using them yet.
We're going to go now to what we call Quickfire Curiosity, which is our short sort of personal and light philosophical trivia to end off with.
Favourite colour and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, exactly that. First question being, would you consider yourself a futurist?
What's a futurist?
Great question. Everybody asks it. I'd like you to have a go at kind of scoping it out.
I'd probably say I am, without knowing what it is, because I imagine it's someone who is thinking forward and consideration for the future in what they do today. So if it's that, I'm it.
Great. Okay. What's been your most unexpected learning of your career in the renewables sector, and how has it shaped your view of the world on a more existential level?
I guess there's two answers to that. One simple answer is that I didn't set out to build a business and do what I'm doing now. It was an idea that came out of working in the sector and seeing that it needed to embrace better use of technology. So it's been a bit of a calling and a drive. So the whole business has been driven from that. So that was quite a surprise. I didn't set out to do this. And I guess the other one that I've just had to kind of come to terms with is that everything still relies around money. And despite the fact that, we've got so much to do, everything has to be profitable. Everything has to be financially viable before people will move and change and do things. And I think what's frustrating about that is it's that financial system that has probably got us into this predicament we find ourselves in. And we're still relying on using that vehicle, if you like, to get us out of it. And I think that's going to be a regret in a way, but I don't know what the alternative is. But That's something that I've just come to terms with, especially running your own business. You have to come to terms with that, that vital sort of inevitability.
Yeah. Has it changed the way that you approach any aspects of building the business? That sort of mindset of almost, I wish it wasn't around profit margins and the bottom line?
I guess I've, speak to my CFO, I've probably got a tendency to do more for people than perhaps they've paid for.
Okay.
I encourage a culture of support and help with our clients. And sometimes you're not necessarily monetizing every aspect of what you do. But I feel sort of a responsibility to make sure that we're doing the best by our clients and they get the most out of it. And sometimes that's a major draw on my time.
You're face to face with your younger self. You meet young Will on the farm. You've got to give him a small piece of advice, both for career trajectory and just life in general. What do you say?
The main thing is just about recognizing early of the problems that we're creating for ourselves with the way we're living as society. And I guess being in a position to make a bigger difference earlier before, I had my epiphany when I was in my early 30s. And therefore, maybe I could have influenced more and changed the outcome. But I don't think that I don't have regrets in the journey that's got me here. I think they've all become vital parts of that journey and they've made me who I am.
Yeah.
So nothing major other than if everyone had a crystal ball, what would you do? I think, we needed to have started this decarbonisation journey way earlier than we did as a society. But you can't buy that time back.
Will, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and I'm really excited to sort of follow your journey as well as Above's as you transition and move into the North American market. So thank you.
Magic. Thanks a lot. Cheers.